Assalamualaikum everyone. This video is about the incidence of indirect taxes among consumers and producers on the basis of price elasticity of demand and price elasticity of supply. Please do watch my previous video that is on the graphical display of the imposition of indirect taxes, and that video will actually tell you the price before the imposition of tax, then the price that will be paid by the consumers after the tax, and the price that will be received by the producers after the tax. And same is when the tax is being removed or taken out. So unless you watch that video, do not start watching this video, because that video is the requirement. Now, the link for that video is available in this video's description, or it can also be probably seen on the screen of the video. So now we move to this topic, tax incidence. Now, what is tax incidence? You must define that as well when you talk about the impact of a tax on consumers and producers. The incidence of tax is how the burden of tax, how the impact of tax will be distributed among consumers and producers. Now, I being in a business of running a school, if government imposes a tax on the fee of the students, and government expects me to charge a tax and pay the tax on every student who is studying in my school, my first attempt would be, or my first preference would be, to shift the burden of that higher tax to the parents and to the students by including that tax amount into the fee bill of the students. But to what extent I can do that? It depends on the PED of my customers. So if my accountant comes and tells me that if we raise the fee now, people will withdraw their kids from our school and our enrollment will fall drastically, I'll be reluctant to shift the burden of higher tax to the parents and to the students. On the other hand, if my accountant reports to me that the tax imposing tax or shifting the burden of tax in the form of higher fee to the parents is very easy, as our education quality is superior to the rest of the market, and people will continue to study at our school even when the fee is high, and in that case the PED is low, and I'll be less uncomfortable, or I'll be more comfortable in shifting the burden of the tax to the parents by raising the fee. Entire discussion which I've just had with you guys, I can sum it up in 4 words. Low elasticity, it results in higher burden. So those who have low elasticity, now there are 2 types of elasticity: PED, consumer elasticity; PES, producer elasticity. The one with a lower elasticity will pay a higher percentage of tax. Lower PED would mean consumers will be burdened more. Low PES, producers will be burdened more. So we remove this and show it through a graph. First, we assume that the PED and PES are similar for both the consumers and the producers. So we show a diagram where demand and supply curves are equally flat or steep. Their slopes look like almost similar to each other. The price before the tax was P1, quantity before the tax was Q1. Because of the tax, supply curve shifts from S1 to S2, and that indirect tax raises the cost of production, shifts the supply curve upward to S2, and the price for consumers goes up to P2, whereas price received by the producer is P2 minus a tax amount, which is the vertical distance between 2 supply curves, and that is P3. So the price for consumers rises from P1 to P2, whereas price for the consumers, for the producers, price falls from P1 to P3. Now this is what consumers lose, and this is what the consumers lose, and this is what the producer lose. So consumer burden of tax is this blue shaded area. Why? Because they are buying units Q2, and for each unit they buy, they pay this extra amount because of tax. So this blue shaded area is the burden of the consumer because of the tax. And the black shaded area is the burden of the tax on the producer, because for every unit they sell, they receive a lower price. By this amount, they will be receiving a lower price by this amount per unit, and multiplied by the number of units. Now this black shaded area becomes the burden of the producer. In this case, both rectangles which are showing the consumer burden of tax and producer burden of tax, they're almost equal. If they don't look equal to you, that's the flaw of my drawing. But I intended to draw a equally steep or equally flat supply and demand curve. So the burden of tax in this case will be divided. Now we move to a case where PED is low. And when PED is low, as I said earlier, there'll be a greater burden of tax on the consumers. So we discussed that. So I will now draw a diagram where I'll make the demand curve as steep as I can, so that I can show a low PED demand curve. Whereas supply curve, I'll make it a flat one. So in this case, PED is low compared to the PES, which is almost the supply curve slope, inverse of slope basically is the PES. So quantity Q1 and P1 is the initial price and quantity. Because of tax, supply curve shifts to S2, and again the vertical distance between two supply curve is the amount of tax per unit. The price for consumers goes up to P1. For the producers, it is P2. So the quantity reduces to Q2, supply curve shifts to S2, price for consumers goes up to P2, and price for the producers goes down to P3 from P1. So what is the consumer burden now? The consumer burden, for every unit they are buying, they are paying this tax. They are paying a higher price. So for every unit, they are paying a higher price, multiplied by the quantity they are buying. This is the consumer burden of the tax. And for the producers, for every unit they sell, they receive a lower price by P1 to P3 and multiply by the quantity, the black shaded area. So the black shaded area is consumer burden of tax, and blue shaded area is consumer burden of tax. You can clearly see that when PED is low, consumer tax burden is high. Low PED would mean consumers will be paying a greater part of tax. Now, just look at the example I gave you in the beginning of this video, that my accountant comes and tells me that the quality of the education of our school is superior, it's unique, it's not available everywhere. So even if we raise the price, people will continue to study at our school, meaning PED is low. In that case, it will be relatively easy for me to shift the burden of that extra tax to the consumer in the form of high prices. So there will be a greater consumer burden. I now move on to the second part of this video, and that is the impact of indirect tax on consumer surplus and producer surplus. So look at this diagram. So I now make this diagram a complete one, and I just join it whenever you show consumer surplus or producer surplus, do link the demand curve with the y-axis. So let me draw a new diagram, because that will help you understand the diagram in a better way. So tax incidence and impact on consumer and producer surplus is now our discussion. So again, I will make the similar demand curve or a flatter demand curve, a steeper demand curve, and a flatter supply curve. So S1 to S2, P1 to P2 is the price. So before tax, supply curve was S1, demand curve was D, price was P1 and quantity was Q1. And after tax, price has gone up for consumers to P2, and for consumer it has gone down to P3. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Consumer surplus. Before the tax, consumer surplus was 1, 2, 3, 4. Area below demand, above price. So consumer surplus was 1, 2, 3, and 4 before the tax. Consumer surplus. Before the tax was 1, 2, and 3, 4. After the tax, below demand curve, above price, it's only 1. So consumer surplus falls by area 2, 3, and 4. This is the reduction in consumer surplus because of the tax. Initially, it was area below demand, above price, 1, 2, 3, 4. After tax, it is only area 1. So decrease in consumer surplus is this shaded area or 2, 3, 4 area. For producer surplus, area below price, above supply. So producer surplus before the tax was 5, 6, and 7. After the tax, it is below price, above supply. It is only 7. Below price, the price for producer is P3. It's not P2. P2 is the price consumer is paying, but producer is not interested in that price. He is interested in what he is getting. He is getting P3. So below price, above supply is 7. So producer surplus falls by 5, 6. So it is the reduction in producer surplus. PS, producer surplus. So this is the decrease in producer surplus. The blue area, shaded area, is a decrease in consumer surplus, and black shaded area is the decrease in the consumer surplus. Again, the loss in consumer surplus is bigger than the loss in producer surplus. Now, out of this becomes this 235. 235 in this diagram, 235 is the government tax receipt. Per unit tax is this quantity multiplied with the quantity. Now, this 235 is the government gain. So, consumers are losing 2, 3, 4, producers are losing 5 and 6. Out of this loss of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 2, 3, and 5 becomes the gain of the government. Now, let me quickly correct. Now, this is the gain. This is the gain of the government, tax revenue. This 235 is tax receipt. So, consumers have lost 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But out of this, 2, 3, 5 has been gained by the government. 4 and 6. Is that loss of consumer surplus? Is that loss of producer surplus, which has not become the gain of anyone? That is why we call 4 and 6 the dead weight loss of tax, or the loss of that tax which does not become the gain of anyone else. I hope you like this video. Thank you.